Hello everyone. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel and leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. Now, let's begin. I'm 31 now, but what happened the summer I turned 24 still sits in the back of my throat every time I drive past an old farmhouse after dark. I grew up in Ohio, went to college in Pittsburgh, and after graduating I took a job doing insurance adjustments for a regional firm that covered rural properties. The pay wasn't great, but it came with a company car and a per diem that let me eat at diners I'd never have found otherwise. Most of my assignments were boring. Storm damage, collapsed barns, the occasional chimney fire. I'd snap photos, fill out forms, and be back in my motel by 6. That's why I remember the file for 412 Beaker Lane so clearly, because for 2 weeks I couldn't get anyone on the phone, and when I finally did, the voice on the other end didn't sound like it belonged to a person who had ever filed a claim. The policyholder was listed as Donald Hessler, a 72-year-old widower who'd reported hail damage on a detached garage. Routine stuff. But every time I called the number on file, it rang 11 times and cut off. No voicemail, no busy signal, just 11 rings and then silence. My supervisor told me to drive out and knock on the door because Mr. Hessler had already cashed the first check and the company wanted confirmation the repairs had been made. Beaker Lane was about 2 hours southeast of the office, deep in a part of the state where the roads stopped being paved and the GPS started lying to you about turns that didn't exist. I got out there on a Tuesday in late July. The sky was that flat, bleached out kind of blue you get right before a storm, and the cicadas were so loud I could hear them through my rolled up windows. Beaker Lane was a gravel road that dead-ended at a single mailbox, and the house behind it was a 2-story farmhouse with peeling white paint and a wraparound porch that sagged in the middle like a tired mouth. The detached garage was there, sure enough, with a brand new metal roof that looked like it had been installed about 6 months ago. That should have been my first clue. The claim had been filed 3 weeks earlier, not 6 months. I parked in the dirt driveway and sat there for a minute, just listening. There wasn't a single sound coming from the house. No television, no radio, no dog barking, nothing. Most rural properties have at least one dog, and most old men living alone keep a TV on for company. This place felt like someone had pressed pause on it. I grabbed my clipboard, my camera, and walked up the porch steps. The boards creaked in a way that seemed too loud, like the house was announcing me. I knocked 3 times. No answer. I knocked again, louder. Still nothing. I was about to leave a door tag and get back in my car when I noticed the front door wasn't fully latched. It had drifted open maybe an inch during my knocking, and through the gap I could see a hallway with a rag rug and a grandfather clock. The clock wasn't ticking. I'll be honest, I should have turned around right then, but I'd driven 2 hours, and if I came back empty-handed, my supervisor was going to send me right back out. So I called out, "Mr. Hessler, it's Ryan from the insurance company. I'm coming in just to check on you." And I pushed the door open. The smell hit me first. Not a bad smell exactly, but a wrong one, like cold pennies and old flowers. The kind of smell you get in a room that's been closed up for a long time with something organic inside it. The living room was neat, almost too neat. There were doilies on every surface, a half-finished crossword puzzle on the coffee table, and a cup of coffee that had gone cold and grown a skin on top. I touched the mug. It was room temperature, but the coffee inside had that translucent film that only forms after a day or more. I called out again, working my way through the house. Kitchen was empty. Dining room was empty. There was a plate of food on the table, a slice of roast beef, and some green beans, but the food had dried out and curled at the edges. A fly was crawling across it. On the counter, the calendar was flipped to the wrong month. June, not July, and every single day of June had a small X through it, done in red pen, except for the last 3 days, which were blank. That's when I heard the footstep above me. It was a single step, right over my head, the kind of sound that makes the ceiling give a little pop. I froze. I called out again, louder this time, identifying myself, saying I was just here about the claim. No answer. Another footstep, then another, and then what sounded like someone dragging a chair across a wooden floor. Every rational part of my brain was screaming at me to leave, but there was this other part, this stupid polite part, that kept thinking, maybe he's hard of hearing, maybe he fell, maybe he needs help. I put my foot on the bottom stair, and that's when the dragging stopped. The house went completely silent. Not the silence of an empty room, the silence of a room where something is listening. I stood there for what felt like a full minute. Then, very slowly, the floorboards above me creaked again, but this time they were moving toward the top of the stairs. Whatever was up there was coming down. I didn't wait. I turned and walked, not ran. Walked back toward the front door, because something in my gut told me that running would be the worst thing I could do. The creaking stopped when I stopped, started again when I moved. I made it to the porch, pulled the door closed behind me, and got in my car. My hands were shaking so hard I dropped my keys twice before getting them in the ignition. As I was backing down the driveway, I looked up at the second floor window. There was a face there, pale, round, with 2 dark holes where the eyes should have been. It wasn't pressed against the glass. It was standing about 3 feet back, in the shadow of the room, just watching me leave. I couldn't tell if it was a man or a woman. I couldn't tell if it was alive. I drove straight to the county sheriff's office and told the deputy at the front desk what I'd seen. He listened, asked me a few questions, and then got very quiet. He said, "Sir, we did a welfare check on Donald Hessler 2 weeks ago. His niece reported him missing after he stopped answering her calls. We searched the property. He wasn't there. I asked who had filed the insurance claim then. The deputy said that was a very good question and one they were trying to answer themselves. They brought me back out to the house that afternoon with 2 deputies and a detective. The front door was locked. The coffee mug was gone from the living room. The plate of food was gone from the dining room. The calendar had been changed to July, and all the X's were gone. The upstairs was empty. There was no dust disturbed, no footprints, no sign anyone had been there in weeks. But in the master bedroom closet, behind a false wall the detective found by tapping on the plaster, there was a small room, no windows, a mattress on the floor, a bucket, and stacked against the far wall, dozens of photo albums, each one full of pictures of the previous occupants of 412 Beaker Lane, going back, according to the dates on the backs of the photos, to 1961. Donald Hessler had bought the house in 2004. He was the 8th owner since 1961. None of the previous 7 had ever been reported missing. They had all simply sold the house and moved on, according to county records, but every single one of them was in those albums, and in every photo they were asleep, taken from above, at night. They never found Donald. They never found whoever had been living in that hidden room. The house went up for auction the following spring, and someone bought it. I don't know who. I quit the insurance job 3 months later and took a desk position at a bank. I don't drive down gravel roads anymore, and I don't answer the door if someone knocks after dark, because sometimes when I'm alone in my apartment late at night, I hear a single footstep in the hallway above me, and I live on the top floor, story 2, the voice on the baby monitor. I want to preface this by saying I am not a superstitious person. I'm a registered nurse. I've worked in emergency rooms for 9 years, and I have seen enough blood, bone, and bad decisions to know that most of what people call supernatural is just bad wiring or worse intentions. My husband Mark is a software engineer. We are by any definition boring, practical people, which is why what happened in our house last March still keeps us both up at night. We have a daughter named Eleanor. She was 14 months old at the time. We live in a 3-bedroom ranch in the suburbs of Raleigh, North Carolina. Nothing fancy, but safe. Quiet street, good neighbors, the kind of place where people still leave packages on the porch without worrying. Eleanor's nursery was at the far end of the hall from our bedroom, so we'd had a baby monitor installed when she was born. One of those video ones with night vision and a two-way speaker so you could talk to the baby without getting up. The camera sat on a shelf above her crib, angled down so we could see her face while she slept. The monitor was a model we'd bought secondhand from a co-worker of Mark's whose kids had outgrown it. It worked fine for over a year. Then one night in early March, I woke up at 2:47 in the morning to the sound of a man's voice coming through the monitor on my nightstand. It wasn't Mark. Mark was asleep next to me, snoring lightly. The voice was soft, almost gentle, and it was speaking to my daughter. It said, "It's okay, sweetheart. You can go back to sleep." I shook Mark awake and he heard it too. We both sat there, frozen, staring at the little glowing screen. And on the screen we could see Eleanor lying in her crib, eyes open, looking up at the ceiling. There was no one else in the room. The camera's wide angle showed the whole nursery, empty, but the voice kept going, soft murmurs, the kind of thing you'd say to soothe a child. "Shh, shh, you're all right," it said. "Everything's all right." Mark threw off the covers and ran down the hall. I watched him on the monitor as he burst into the nursery, flipped on the light, and scooped Eleanor up out of the crib. The voice had stopped the second the door opened. Mark searched the whole room, the closet, under the crib, the window, everything. Nothing. Eleanor was fine. She wasn't crying, she wasn't scared. She just looked up at her father and said, "Man," pointing at the corner. We spent the rest of that night in the living room, all three of us on the couch, with every light in the house on. Mark checked every door and window. Everything was locked. He checked the monitor itself, pulled the battery, unplugged the camera. The next morning, he drove to a big box store and bought a brand new monitor, different brand, different frequency, sealed in plastic. We installed it that afternoon and put Eleanor down for her nap. 3 hours later, as she was waking up, we heard the same voice. It said, "There you are." Mark called the police. They came out, took a report, searched the property, and found nothing. They suggested our monitor's frequency might be picking up a neighbor's signal, which happens more often than people think with wireless devices. It was a reasonable explanation. It was also wrong, because we just replaced the monitor with a different frequency. The officer who took our report was a woman in her 40s named Officer Delgado. She was kind but professional, and before she left, she took me aside on the porch and asked how long we'd lived in the house. 3 years, I told her. She asked if we'd bought it or rented it. Bought. She nodded slowly, then asked if we knew the history of the property. I said no, just that it had been built in 1972, and the previous owners were an older couple who'd moved to Florida. She told me she'd lived in the area for a long time, and that she remembered a case from our street from about 15 years back. A family with a young child. The child had been taken from her bedroom in the middle of the night. The family had moved away afterward. They never caught anyone. She wasn't sure if it was the same house, but she said if I wanted she could look it up. I told her yes, please. She called me back 2 days later. It was the same house, 1999. A 4-year-old girl named Haley had been taken from the back bedroom, the one we were using as Eleanor's nursery. She'd been found 3 days later, alive, wandering in a park about 2 miles away. She couldn't or wouldn't say where she'd been. Her family sold the house and moved to Arizona. The man who had taken her was never identified. He'd gained entry through a crawl space under the house that led up through a cold air return in the hallway. After the incident, the owners had sealed the crawl space and had the return replaced. Officer Delgado asked if we'd ever looked in our crawl space. I said no. Mark had once, when we first bought the house, to check the pipes. He said it was clean and dry. That afternoon, Mark pulled up the hatch in the hallway closet and went down with a flashlight. I stood at the opening with Eleanor on my hip. He was down there for maybe 90 seconds before I heard him say, "Oh, Jesus." He came back up fast, white as a sheet, and told me to go sit in the car with Eleanor and call Officer Delgado. What he found was a small nest, not an animal's nest, a person's. A pile of old blankets, a camping lantern, a few empty water bottles, and a crumpled fast food bag with a receipt from 2 weeks earlier. And directly under Eleanor's nursery, the insulation had been pushed aside, and a small hole had been cut through the subfloor, just big enough for a person to put their face up to, just big enough for a voice to carry through. The police found fingerprints. They matched a man who had been released from prison in January. He'd lived on our street as a teenager, in the house directly across from ours. He was arrested 3 days later at a motel 6 miles away. In his car, they found photographs of Eleanor, taken through her bedroom window, going back 4 months. We sold the house. We moved to a second-floor apartment in a building with a doorman. Eleanor is 2 now, and she's fine. She doesn't remember any of it. But sometimes, when she's in her room playing alone and I'm in the kitchen, I'll hear her talking to someone, and when I ask her who she's talking to, she just points at the ceiling and says, "Man." Story 3. The Long Shift. My name is Derek, I'm 36, and I've been driving long haul for almost 12 years. I run the Northern Corridor mostly, Chicago to Seattle, sometimes dipping down into Salt Lake or out to Boise depending on the load. Trucking gets inside you after a while. The long stretches, the way the horizon stops feeling like a place you're going and starts feeling like a thing that's following you. Most of us have stories, most of us don't tell them, but this one I have to because I still can't explain it, and my wife says writing it down might help. This happened in October of 2022. I was hauling a reefer load of beef out of a plant in Nebraska, heading up through Wyoming toward a distribution center in Spokane. It was a run I'd done maybe 50 times. I knew every rest area, every fuel stop, every patch of black ice that showed up on the same curve every winter. I left Nebraska around noon, hit the Wyoming line just after sundown, and settled into that long, empty stretch of 80 that runs west through Laramie and Rawlins. If you've ever driven it, you know what I mean. It's dark out there. No towns for hours, just sagebrush and antelope, and the occasional train running parallel to the highway. Around 9 p.m., I stopped at a pilot just outside Rawlins to fuel up and grab a sandwich. While I was paying, a woman came up to me at the counter. She was probably in her 60s, gray hair pulled back in a braid, wearing a brown barn coat that was 2 sizes too big for her. She asked if I was heading west. I said I was. She asked where. I said Spokane, through Idaho. She nodded like that was the answer she wanted. And she said, "Don't pick anyone up tonight, no matter what you see." I kind of laughed and said, "Ma'am, I don't pick up hitchhikers anyway, company policy." She didn't laugh back. She just looked at me with this very tired expression and said, "It won't look like a hitchhiker." And then she walked out of the store before I could ask her what she meant. I asked the kid behind the counter if he knew her. He shrugged and said she came in about once a month and always said something weird to one of the truckers. He figured she was just lonely. I paid, got back in my truck, and pulled out onto 80 with the radio on and the heat cranked up, because October in Wyoming at night is colder than it has any right to be. The first 100 miles were normal. Dark, empty, but normal. The CB was quiet except for the occasional chatter from guys running behind me. I was making good time. Somewhere around the exit for Wamsutter, I saw the first figure. It was standing on the shoulder, maybe a quarter mile ahead, facing the highway. My headlights caught it for a second before I passed. A man, or the shape of a man, in a long dark coat, with his hands at his sides. No car anywhere, no broken down vehicle, no flares, nothing. Just a person standing by the road in the middle of nowhere at 10 at night. I didn't slow down. I remembered what the woman had said, and honestly, even without her warning, I wouldn't have stopped. You learn pretty quickly in this job that roadside figures at night are never what they seem. 20 miles later, I saw another one. Same coat, same posture, standing on the shoulder, facing the road. Now I want to be clear. These were not the same person. I was doing 70. There is no way anyone could have gotten ahead of me, but the figure looked identical, same height, same coat, same way of just standing there, arms loose at the sides. The third one was 30 miles after that. Same thing. By the fourth, my hands were sweating on the wheel. I got on the CB and asked if anyone else running west on 80 was seeing people on the shoulder. Dead air. I tried channel 19, channel 17, nothing. It was like I was the only truck on the road, which couldn't be right, because I'd passed at least 3 other rigs going the other way in the last hour. The fifth figure was different. It was walking, slowly in my direction, on the shoulder. As I got closer, my headlights caught its face, and my stomach dropped into my boots. It was a woman, grey hair pulled back in a braid, brown barn coat, the woman from the gas station. She was over 300 miles from where I'd seen her, walking west, in the middle of the night, in the middle of nowhere. I didn't stop. I kept my eyes on the road and I drove past her, and in my side mirror, I watched her turn her head to follow my truck as I went by. She didn't wave. She didn't try to flag me down. She just watched. About 10 miles later, a voice came over the CB. It wasn't a trucker's voice. It was soft, and it was close, like the person was sitting in my cab. It said, "You should have stopped." I almost drove off the road. I checked my mirrors. I checked the sleeper behind me. I was alone. I grabbed the CB and said, "Who is this?" The voice said, "You should have stopped for her. She's been out there a long time." I turned the CB off. I turned the radio off. I drove the next 200 miles in complete silence with my hand on the door handle, because I had this terrible feeling that if I looked in the sleeper, I would see someone sitting on my bunk. I didn't look. I just drove. I pulled into a truck stop at Little America around 2 in the morning, went inside, ordered the largest coffee they had, and sat at the counter for an hour before I could convince myself to go back out to the truck. When I finally did, I checked the sleeper with a flashlight. It was empty, but there was a single gray hair on my pillow, long, pulled into a slight curl at the end, like it had been braided. I finished the run. I delivered the load. I drove home to Ohio, and I slept for 14 hours straight. A few weeks later, I was telling the story to an older driver named Hank at a truck stop in Indiana. He went quiet when I described the woman. He asked if she'd told me not to pick anyone up. I said yes. He said his cousin had driven that stretch for 30 years and had seen the same woman 4 times. The last time, his cousin had stopped for a hitchhiker about 50 miles after the warning. A young guy, clean-cut, said his car broke down. His cousin drove him about 20 miles and dropped him at an exit. When he got back in the truck after the guy got out, the passenger seat was soaking wet, like someone had poured a bucket of river water on it, and his cousin's wallet was gone, and the guy's footprints leading away from the truck, in the dirt of the exit ramp, stopped after about 10 feet. Just stopped, like he'd walked into the air. I don't run that stretch anymore. I take 70 now, through Denver, even though it adds 6 hours. My company asked why, and I told them it was traffic. They didn't push. Truckers get superstitious. They understand, but sometimes when I'm driving at night on any road, anywhere, and my headlights catch a figure on the shoulder, I feel that same cold in my chest, and I think about the hair on my pillow, and I keep driving, and I don't look in the mirror. Story 4. The cabin we rented. My girlfriend Cassie and I rented a cabin in the Smoky Mountains last October for our 3rd anniversary. We'd been saving for a few months. Nothing fancy, just a little A-frame on a private lot with a hot tub and a view of the ridge. I found it on one of those vacation rental sites. 47 reviews, all 5 stars. A very enthusiastic host named Marcus, who answered messages within minutes and sent us a detailed welcome packet before we even booked. The price was honestly too good for the location, which should have been my first warning, but we were 26 years old and in love, and looking for a reason to believe in luck. The drive up was beautiful. We left Charlotte around noon on a Friday and got to the cabin just before sunset. The last 2 miles were a dirt road that wound up through pine trees so thick the sky disappeared above us. The cabin itself was gorgeous, rough-cut logs, a wraparound porch, a fire pit out front, and a view down into a valley that looked like something off a postcard. Cassie actually clapped when we pulled in. Marcus had left a key in a lockbox on the porch, along with a handwritten note welcoming us and listing the Wi-Fi password, the hot tub instructions, and the trash pickup schedule. Everything was exactly as advertised. We unloaded our bags, opened a bottle of wine, and sat on the porch watching the last of the light drain out of the valley. I remember thinking it was the most peaceful place I'd ever been. The first night was fine. We made pasta, watched a movie, and went to bed early because the drive had worn us out. I woke up once around 3 in the morning because I thought I heard footsteps on the porch. But when I got up and looked out the window, there was nothing there. I chalked it up to deer or raccoons and went back to sleep. Saturday morning, we drove into Gatlinburg for breakfast and spent the day hiking a trail that started about 20 minutes from the cabin. It was a perfect day. We got back around 5, fired up the hot tub, and ate leftovers on the porch while the sun went down. Around 8, Cassie went inside to shower, and I stayed out by the fire pit finishing my beer. That's when I noticed the camera. It was small, a little black circle, tucked up in the corner of the porch ceiling right above the front door. I probably wouldn't have seen it if the firelight hadn't caught it just right. I stood up and looked closer. It was definitely a camera, definitely pointed down at the porch. I walked inside and looked at the ceilings. There was another one in the living room, mounted in the exhaust fan of the ceiling light, and one in the hallway, tucked into a smoke detector, and one in the bedroom, in the alarm clock on the nightstand. Cassie was in the shower. I didn't want to freak her out, but I also didn't want her getting out of the shower in front of a camera I couldn't find in the bathroom. I went in and turned the light off, and then, using my phone's flashlight at an angle, I scanned the corners. There was a camera in the bathroom, in the vent above the toilet, aimed directly at the shower. I told Cassie to stay in the shower and not to come out. I grabbed a towel, held it up in front of the vent, and told her to get dressed behind the towel where the camera couldn't see her. She was terrified, obviously. We packed our bags in about 10 minutes without saying anything. I didn't want whoever was watching to hear us planning to leave. We loaded the car. I left the porch light on and the TV on inside to make it look like we were still there. We drove back down that dirt road in the dark with Cassie shaking in the passenger seat, and I didn't stop until we were in a gas station in Pigeon Forge. I called the police from the gas station. They took it seriously, sent a unit out to the cabin. When they searched it, they found 7 cameras, 6 that we'd spotted, and 1 in the smoke detector directly above the bed. All of them were wireless, all of them streaming to a private server. The server was traced to an IP address belonging to a man named Marcus Feld, the host. When they arrested him the next day, they found on his computer over 4 years of footage from that cabin. Hundreds of couples, families, bachelorette parties. He had folders labeled with the names of guests, organized by date, with what the detective told me later were, quote, disturbing annotations. The detective wouldn't tell me more than that. She said I didn't want to know, and she was right. Marcus had been a respected member of the community. He coached Little League. He was a deacon at his church. He had been renting that cabin for 6 years. None of the 47 reviewers had any idea they'd been filmed. What got me, what still gets me, was something the detective said when I asked if he'd ever acted on any of it. She paused for a long time and then said, "Mr. Sullivan, we're looking into the disappearance of a young woman who stayed there in 2021. She never made it home. The host reported her as a no-show checkout. Her car was found at a rest area in Knoxville. We're looking at him for it now, and we think she might not be the only one." We got our money back. Cassie and I stayed together. We're married now, but we don't stay in rental cabins anymore. We stay in hotels with lobbies and doormen and other people. And every time I walk into a room I don't own, the first thing I do is check the smoke detectors, the vents, the clocks, every corner, because I know now that the scariest thing isn't always in the woods outside the cabin. Sometimes it's in the ceiling above your bed, and it's been there the whole time, just watching, just waiting for you to fall asleep. Story 5, The Substitute. I teach 5th grade at a public elementary school in a small town in western Pennsylvania. I've been there 11 years. I love my job, I love my kids, and until last January, I would have told you that the scariest thing that had ever happened to me at work was the time a parent cornered me in the parking lot over a B-. Now I know better. We had a substitute teacher come in that January. I was out for 3 days with the flu, and when I got back on Thursday, my kids were different, quieter. They didn't make eye contact. When I asked them about the substitute, they all said the same thing in almost the same words. She was nice. She read us a book. She taught us a new song. I asked what book. They couldn't remember. I asked what song. They looked at each other, and then one of them, a girl named Priya, who was one of my brightest students, started humming. It wasn't a song I'd ever heard before. It was a low, slow, repetitive melody, and when she hummed it, 3 other kids started humming along without being asked, like they all knew it, like it was something they'd been practicing for a long time. I told them that was enough, and we moved on with the day. But it bothered me. After school, I went to the main office to find out who the substitute had been. Our secretary Linda pulled up the log. There was no substitute on record for my classroom those 3 days. According to the log, my class had been split up and distributed among the other 5th grade rooms, which is standard when we can't find a sub on short notice. I said, Linda, my kids told me they had a sub, a woman. She read them a book. Linda looked at me like I was crazy and pulled up the attendance records for the other 5th grade classes. My kids weren't on any of them. For 3 days, my classroom had been marked as having a substitute that didn't exist, and my students had been somewhere with someone that the school had no record of. I went to my principal. His name is Mr. Halperin, and he's a good man, the kind of administrator who actually knows every kid's name. When I told him what I'd found, his face changed. He asked me to sit down and close the door. He said he needed to tell me something, and he needed me to not repeat it. He said this had happened before, not to my class, but to another class, about 6 years ago. A different teacher had been out sick. The kids had come back talking about a substitute nobody could find in the records, humming a song the teacher didn't recognize. Over the next few months, 3 of those students had, quote, changed. One had started sleepwalking and had been found outside in her pajamas in February, standing in her backyard facing the woods. One had stopped speaking for almost a year. One had, and here Mr. Halperin got very quiet, attempted to hurt his baby sister. The teacher had quit. The principal at the time had buried it. Mr. Halperin had only found the file when he took over, and he'd hoped it was a one-off. I went home that night and did something I'd never done as a teacher. I called the parents of every single one of my 22 students and asked if I could speak to their child on the phone for a minute. I asked each one the same 3 questions. What did the substitute look like? What book did she read? What song did she teach them? Every single answer was the same. She was tall. She had dark hair. She wore a gray dress. The book was about a little boy who lived in a house at the edge of the forest. The song didn't have words. 22 children, identical answers. No one could remember her face. I went to the police the next morning. They took a report, but there wasn't much they could do. No crime had been committed that they could identify. The kids were physically unharmed. No one could prove anyone had been in the school building without authorization. The school's camera system had conveniently malfunctioned for those 3 days. A technician came out and said the hard drive had been wiped. Over the next few weeks, I watched my students carefully. Most of them were fine, but 4 of them started showing changes. Priya stopped raising her hand in class. A boy named Ethan started drawing the same picture over and over. A tall woman in a gray dress standing in front of a house in the woods. A girl named Madison began sleepwalking, and a boy named Caleb, who had always been gentle, got into 3 fights in 2 weeks. I told the parents. Some took it seriously, some didn't. Priya's parents pulled her out of the school and moved her to a private academy across the county. Ethan's parents took him to a therapist. Madison's family installed a door alarm. Caleb's parents said he was going through a phase. In March, Caleb's baby brother was hospitalized. Caleb had tried to smother him with a pillow. He was 6 years old. When the social worker asked him why, he said, "The lady in the gray dress told me to." Caleb is in a residential facility now. Madison sleepwalked out of her house one night in April and was found 3 miles away, standing at the edge of a state forest, humming that song. Ethan still draws the woman. Priya, last I heard, is doing well at her new school. I still teach. I still love my job. But every time I take a sick day, I make my husband drive past the school during the day to check that my classroom light is off and nobody's parked in the lot who shouldn't be. And every year, on the first day of school, I look at my new class and I wait to see if any of them will start humming a song I don't recognize. So far, none of them have, but I keep listening. Story 6. The Basement Apartment. I moved to Boston for graduate school in the fall of 2019. The rent in the city was brutal, and the best I could afford on a stipend was a basement apartment in a 3-family in Dorchester. The landlord was an older Irish guy named Mr. Sullivan, who owned the whole building and lived on the top floor. The family on the middle floor, the O'Briens, were young, friendly, had a toddler and a rescue dog. The basement had its own entrance around the back, through a little concrete stairwell that filled up with leaves every fall. It was damp, it was small, and the ceiling was so low that I could touch it flat-handed. But it was $600 under market, and I was 23 and broke. I signed the lease in August. I moved in during a heat wave. Mr. Sullivan met me at the door with a box of keys and a handshake and a warning. He said, "Now I'll tell you. The previous tenant was a strange one. Left in a hurry. Didn't ask for his deposit back. If you find anything of his, just put it in a box in the utility room, and I'll see what to do with it." I asked what kind of strange. Mr. Sullivan just shook his head and said, "The kind you don't want to think about too much." Then he gave me the keys and went upstairs. The apartment was mostly clean, but there were little signs of the previous tenant everywhere. A coffee mug in the cabinet with a chip on the rim, a pair of reading glasses on a shelf in the closet, a phone charger still plugged into the wall behind the bed. I boxed it all up over the first weekend and put the box in the utility room like Mr. Sullivan had asked. The weird stuff started about 2 weeks in. It began with a smell. The apartment had always had a faint basement smell, mildew and old wood. But one morning I woke up and the whole place reeked of something different, something sour and organic, like meat left out too long. I tore the apartment apart looking for the source. I emptied the fridge, the trash, checked under the bed, in the closet. I couldn't find anything. By that afternoon the smell was gone. It came back 3 days later, in the middle of the night. I woke up gagging. I stumbled out of bed and turned on the light, and the smell vanished the second I hit the switch. I stood there in my boxers, breathing in a perfectly normal-smelling apartment, and I started to feel like I was losing my mind. Then came the sounds. Scratching, at first, always behind the wall that separated my bedroom from the utility room. I figured it was mice, and I told Mr. Sullivan, and he put down traps. The traps never caught anything, but the scratching kept happening, always at night, always between 2 and 3 in the morning. One night in October, the scratching was louder than usual, and it was followed by what I can only describe as a wet sound, a slow, heavy, shifting sound, like something damp moving across concrete. I sat up in bed and listened for almost 10 minutes. The sound moved. It went from the wall behind my bed, along the wall, around the corner, and stopped at the wall opposite my closet. Then it was quiet. I got up, grabbed a flashlight, and went into the utility room. Everything was where I'd left it. The box of the previous tenant's stuff, the water heater, the furnace, a stack of boxes that belonged to Mr. Sullivan. I checked behind everything. Nothing. But the box I'd packed up for the previous tenant was open. Not knocked over, open. The flaps were folded back neatly, as if someone had opened it to look inside. I went upstairs the next morning and knocked on the O'Brien's door. I asked Mrs. O'Brien if she'd been in the utility room recently. She said no. They had their own storage in the attic. I asked if Mr. Sullivan had been down. She said not that she'd seen. I asked her, as casually as I could, if she knew anything about the previous tenant. She got very still. She looked at her toddler, who was playing on the floor behind her, and she stepped out into the hallway and closed the door halfway. She said the previous tenant had been a man in his 30s named Peter. Quiet, polite. He'd lived there for about 4 years. And then, in the spring, he had started acting strange, talking to himself in the stairwell, asking her husband weird questions about the house, asking if they'd ever heard anything from the basement, if the baby ever cried for no reason, if the dog ever refused to go downstairs. She said one morning in May, Peter had come up to their apartment at 6 in the morning, pounding on the door, saying he needed to use their phone. His own phone, he said, wouldn't work in the basement anymore. He said something was wrong with the walls. He wouldn't elaborate. He called someone, spoke quietly for a few minutes, and left. That afternoon, a U-Haul showed up. Peter loaded about a third of his stuff into it, left the rest, and drove away. Nobody had seen him since. Mrs. O'Brien lowered her voice and said her husband had gone down into the basement a few days later, when the smell got bad, to check for a dead rat. He hadn't found a rat, but he had found, in the utility room, a section of wall that had been cut open and patched with new drywall. It was sloppy work. It hadn't been there before. Her husband had told Mr. Sullivan. Mr. Sullivan had said he'd take care of it. Within a week, the patch had been covered with a fresh coat of paint, and a shelving unit had been bolted to the wall in front of it. I went back down to my apartment and stared at the utility room wall. The shelving unit was there. The paint was fresh. I could see, now that I was looking for it, the faint outline of the patch behind the shelves. I packed a bag that night and stayed with a friend. I came back 2 days later with a contractor friend of mine named Luis. I told Luis everything. He looked at the wall, looked at me and said, "You want to know what's back there?" I said yes. He said, "Are you sure?" I said yes. He took down the shelving unit. He cut through the drywall. Behind the wall was a space about 2 feet deep, running maybe 6 feet along the foundation. Inside the space was a mattress, folded, stained. Next to it was a plastic bin, sealed, full of women's clothing, sizes varying, some of it with the tags still on, and behind the bin, wedged against the foundation, was a spiral notebook with dates in it, going back almost 6 years. I didn't read the notebook. I called the police. The investigation took months. I'm not going to go into all of it here because it's still technically ongoing. Peter was found in February, living under a different name in Rhode Island. He was arrested. I don't know what he did in that hidden room. I have some guesses. I don't want to know more than I have to. Mr. Sullivan claimed he didn't know anything. He claimed he'd only patched the wall because Peter had told him he'd accidentally damaged it. The police are, I believe, still investigating that claim. Mr. Sullivan is 78. I don't know if anything will come of it. I moved out the next weekend. I finished grad school, got a job, and now I live in a building with security cameras in the lobby and no basement. But for a long time afterward, I would wake up at 2 in the morning, certain I could hear scratching in the wall, and I would lie there in my new apartment, on my new bed, and I would think about the fact that I had slept 6 feet from that space for almost 3 months. That whatever had been in there, whatever had made the sounds, had been that close to me every night. And I hadn't known, and Peter had known, and he had stayed for 4 years, and I still don't understand why. Story 7. The last patient. I worked as a night shift medical assistant at a small family medicine clinic in central Indiana for about 2 years after nursing school. It was a transition job, really, something to pay the bills while I figured out where I wanted to go. The clinic was in a 1-story building on a county road between 2 small towns, and it was open until 10 p.m. 3 nights a week to serve people who couldn't get in during the day. The after-hours crowd was usually pretty manageable. Sore throats, ear infections, the occasional sprained ankle. Nothing that would prepare me for what happened on the night of November 14th, 2021. I was working with Dr. Patel, a general practitioner in his 50s, who had the calmest bedside manner I've ever seen, and our receptionist Becky, who was in her early 20s and chewed gum constantly. It had been a slow night. We'd seen maybe 6 patients, and by 9:30 the waiting room was empty. Becky was shutting down the front computers, and Dr. Patel was in his office finishing up charting. I was restocking the exam rooms. We were all counting down the minutes to 10. At 9:47, the front door chimed. Becky groaned, and I heard her say, "We're closing in 12 minutes, sir. Is this urgent?" I heard a man's voice, soft, polite, saying yes, very urgent. He wouldn't be long. Becky sighed and handed him a clipboard. I poked my head out of exam room 2 and got my first look at him. He was tall, maybe 6'3", and skinny in the way that makes clothes hang wrong. He was wearing a brown corduroy jacket that was probably 30 years old, and khaki pants that were too short at the ankle. His hair was grey and parted on the side like an old photograph. His face, and I remember this clearly, was completely unremarkable. If I had to describe him to a sketch artist right now, I couldn't. It was the kind of face your eyes slid off of. Every time I tried to look at him directly, my gaze drifted to the side. He filled out the clipboard and handed it back to Becky. I saw her read it, and I saw her face do this little flicker, like she'd read something she didn't understand. She glanced up at him, then back down at the paper, and then she got up and walked quickly to Dr. Patel's office. She closed the door behind her. I was standing in the hallway with the supply cart. The man was standing at the reception desk, facing forward, perfectly still, with his hands folded in front of him. He didn't look at me. He didn't look at anything. He just stood there. Becky came back out. Her face was pale. She said, "Sir, Dr. Patel will see you in a moment." She didn't chew her gum the whole time. The man nodded once, very slightly, and remained standing. Dr. Patel came out a minute later and asked the man to follow him to exam room 1. They went in and closed the door. Becky grabbed my arm and pulled me into exam room 3 and shut the door behind us. She was shaking. She said, "Look at this." She showed me her phone. She'd taken a picture of the clipboard. In the box for reason for visit, the man had written, in neat block letters, "I need someone to verify I am alive." In the box for address, he had written the address of a cemetery about 4 miles away. In the box for emergency contact, he had written my name, my first name, my last name, and my cell phone number. I had never met this man before in my life. My stomach turned to ice water. I asked Becky if she'd called the police. She said she was about to. Dr. Patel had told her to give him 5 minutes with the patient, and then call if he didn't come out. We waited in exam room 3. 4 minutes passed. At 3 minutes and 50 seconds, Becky's hand was on her phone, ready to dial. At exactly 4 minutes, the door to exam room 1 opened, and we heard Dr. Patel's voice, completely calm, saying, "Thank you for coming in. Have a good night." We heard footsteps cross the waiting room. We heard the front door chime, and then nothing. We came out of exam room 3. Dr. Patel was standing in the hallway. He looked at us both, and he said, "I need you both to sit down." Dr. Patel had been a doctor for 27 years. He had served 2 tours in Afghanistan as an army medic. He was not a man who rattled easily, but his hands were shaking when he poured himself a cup of coffee in the break room. He said the patient had come in, sat down on the exam table, and asked Dr. Patel to check his pulse. Dr. Patel had put his fingers to the man's wrist. There was no pulse. He checked the other wrist. Nothing. He put his stethoscope to the man's chest. No heartbeat. He checked the man's temperature with a forehead thermometer. It read 64.2 degrees Fahrenheit. Room temperature. The man had watched all of this with a pleasant, patient expression. When Dr. Patel was done, the man had said, "Thank you, doctor. I just wanted to be sure." And then he had stood up, straightened his jacket, and walked out. Dr. Patel told us that when he had first put his fingers to the man's wrist, he had expected to find a pulse. He had a story ready in his head about how the man must be anxious, how we could refer him to a psychiatrist, how this was clearly a mental health issue. But the skin under his fingers had been cold, not cool. Cold. The kind of cold you feel when you touch a steak from the refrigerator. He said he had done everything a doctor does when a patient has no pulse, which is nothing, because usually when a patient has no pulse, they are unconscious. They are lying down. They require CPR. They are not sitting upright on an exam table, making eye contact, thanking you for your time. Becky called the police. They came within 20 minutes. They took our statements. They took the clipboard. They took Dr. Patel's statement twice because the officer who took the first one made him repeat it for her sergeant. They drove out to the cemetery address the man had written down. They came back an hour later. They told us that the address the man had given was a real cemetery and that there was a real headstone at that address with a name carved into it and a date of death of November 14th, 1991, 30 years to the day from the night he had come into our clinic. They never identified the man. There were no fingerprints on the clipboard. The footage from the clinic showed him entering, sitting down, filling out the form, going into the exam room, coming out and leaving. But his face on every single frame was blurred, not obscured by motion, not hidden by shadow, blurred like someone had taken a thumb and smudged him out of existence. At first we assumed it was a glitch. Cheap security systems do that sometimes. Compression artifacts, frame tearing. But it wasn't just the camera at reception. It was the hallway camera, the exam room camera, even the exterior camera pointed at the parking lot. Everywhere he appeared, the image degraded. Not the room, not the walls, not the other people, just him. Dr. Patel stopped watching halfway through the second replay. He said it made him feel nauseous, like his brain was trying to focus on something it wasn't allowed to understand. The police took the footage. They didn't come back. That should have been the end of it. That's what I told myself. People come in, people leave. Sometimes they're strange. Sometimes things don't make sense. You move on. But the next morning, Becky didn't show up. She was never late. I called her, straight to voicemail. I texted, nothing. Around noon, Dr. Patel asked if I could cover the front desk while he called her emergency contact. He came out of his office 10 minutes later looking pale. They said she left for work, he told me. At the usual time, we both looked at her empty chair. Her coffee mug was still there, half full, cold. That was when I noticed the clipboard. The same clipboard the man had used the night before. It was sitting on the desk. I remember very clearly watching the officer take it. I remember the way she slid it into a plastic evidence bag, but there it was, waiting. I don't know why I picked it up. I wish I hadn't. The form was blank. Not just a new sheet. The same sheet. I recognized the faint crease in the corner, the tiny coffee stain near the bottom, but the handwriting was gone. Every word he had written, his name, the cemetery address, gone. Except for one thing. At the very bottom, where patients sign, there was writing. Not his. It was Becky's handwriting. I knew it instantly. She dotted her I's too hard. It always tore the paper just a little. It said, "I saw him leave with me." I dropped the clipboard. Dr. Patel asked what was wrong, but I couldn't speak. My throat felt like it had closed. We closed the clinic early that day. The police didn't file a missing persons report until the next morning. They told us adults disappear all the time. Most come back. Becky didn't. 3 days later, I started hearing the knocking. It always happened at closing time. 3 soft taps on the glass door. The first night, I thought it was a patient arriving late. I went to unlock it, but there was no one there. The second night, I didn't check. The third night, I did. I don't know why. Curiosity maybe, or something worse. I opened the door just a crack, and I saw footprints, wet footprints, leading into the clinic, bare feet. They stopped right at the reception desk, right where Becky used to sit. I didn't sleep that night or the next. Dr. Patel said we should ignore it. Old buildings make noise, he said. Stress does strange things to perception. He didn't stay late anymore. A week passed, then another. People started canceling appointments. Word spreads even when no one says anything out loud. One evening, as I was locking up, I saw something on the schedule. A name, handwritten, in Becky's handwriting. 6:30 p.m., follow-up. No patient name, no notes, just that. I was alone. The clinic was silent, and it was already 6:45. I told myself it was nothing. Then I heard the exam room door close. Not slam. Click. Slow and deliberate. I stood there for a long time, staring down the hallway. Every instinct told me to leave. Instead, I walked toward it. Each step felt wrong, like I was moving against something unseen. The door to exam room 2 was shut. That was the room Dr. Patel had seen him in. I knocked. No answer. I opened it. The room was empty, but the exam table paper had been crumpled, like someone had just sat up. And the air was cold. Not cool, cold, like refrigerated air spilling out of a broken seal. On the tray beside the table sat the clipboard, the same one. I knew it before I even picked it up. This time the form wasn't blank. It was filled out, neatly, carefully. Patient name, Rebecca L. Date of birth, address, the same cemetery. Plot number included. Date of death, today's date. My hands started shaking. There was a sound behind me, a soft shifting noise, like someone adjusting their weight. I turned, and for a moment, for just a moment, I thought I saw someone sitting on the table. A shape, a person, but their face wouldn't stay still. It blurred and stretched, like the camera footage, like reality itself didn't want to commit to what it was seeing. Then it was gone. The paper on the table was smooth again. The room was empty. The clipboard slipped from my hands. I ran. I didn't lock the clinic. I didn't turn off the lights. I just ran. I never went back. Dr. Patel did, at least for a few days. Then he stopped answering calls. The clinic closed permanently a month later. No explanation, just a notice on the door. But sometimes, late at night, when I can't sleep, I think about that clipboard, and I wonder if someone else is sitting at that desk now, if someone else is hearing the knocking, if someone else will pick it up and see their name already written down. The next story I'm going to tell you isn't mine, but it started the same way, with a list. A friend of mine, Daniel, worked night security at a small office building downtown. Nothing unusual ever happened there. His job was mostly walking floors, checking doors, and staying awake until the list appeared. It was taped to the inside of the security office door. Plain white paper, typed, 12 names. At first, Daniel assumed it was some kind of employee roster, but the building only had 8 tenants, and he recognized one of the names immediately, his own. He laughed it off, took a picture, texted it to me. "Guess I'm getting promoted," he joked. But that night, at exactly 2:13 a.m., the first name on the list was crossed out. He didn't see it happen. He just looked up from his phone, glanced at the paper, and noticed the change. A single neat line through the first name. He checked the timestamp on his phone. 2:13, the same moment the building's fire alarm panel logged a fault on the 3rd floor. He went to check it. Everything was normal. No smoke, no fire, no people. But one of the office doors was open. Inside, a chair was pulled out from a desk, and on that desk sat a single piece of paper, a resignation letter, signed, dated, time 2:13 a.m. The name matched the one crossed off the list. Daniel didn't tell anyone, not at first, but the next night, it happened again. 2:13 a.m., another name crossed out, another incident somewhere in the building. Another empty room that felt wrong. By the 4th night, Daniel stopped sleeping during the day. He said he didn't trust it, didn't trust that the list wouldn't change while he wasn't watching. He stayed in the security office, staring at it, waiting. At 2:13 a.m., he told me later, he didn't blink, not once. He watched the paper, and he swore the ink moved, not quickly, not dramatically, just appeared, like it had always been there. A line drawn through the next name. He quit the next morning, didn't even finish his shift, but before he left, he checked the list one last time. There were only 3 names left. Mine wasn't one of them. His was. I haven't heard from Daniel since. His number still rings, but no one answers. There's one more thing. A week after he disappeared, I got an envelope in the mail. No return address. Inside was a single sheet of paper, typed. A list of names, 12 of them. At the bottom, a blank line. If you're still listening, if you're still awake, check the doors, listen for the knocking. And if you ever see your name written down somewhere it shouldn't be, don't ignore it. Because sometimes it's not a warning, it's a record. Thank you for listening. Lock your doors, turn off the lights, and try not to think about what might already be waiting for you in the dark. Good night.